Turn me down just a little bit, Michael. I said, turn me down just a hair, please. If you would. I feel like I might get wound up. All right, we are in Matthew chapters 17 and 18 tonight. So, get to the right page here. The end of Matthew 16 that we almost got to last week. Jesus talks about there at the very end of the chapter, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. For what will a man be profited if he gains the whole world or forfeits his soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will recompense every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some there of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they shall see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So there's a wealth of stuff going on there in that passage. First of all, the idea of taking up our cross and following after Jesus, and that is not I think it was just said recently in a lesson, that is not a minor inconvenience. You know, that's not something about, oh, we had to give up trick-or-treating tonight so that we could come to worship services, you know, and so that's taking up our cross and those kind of things. That's not what that means at all. Taking up our cross, when Jesus took up his cross, he was going to die, and he had already been beaten and rejected and all those things. So taking up our cross is a significant statement. It's a significant act. And Jesus talks about, you know, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? That's not a trivial thing. That's not a small thing. And so sometimes when we use that phrase of taking up our cross, we kind of diminish a little bit what that really is talking about, or we soften it to mean something that's kind of a minor inconvenience. So we need to be careful with that. But the interesting thing to me is that what Jesus says in verse 27, for the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels. So Jesus tells us about what his appearing is going to be, and what he is going to look like in that appearing, what form he is going to take in that appearing, and then what's the very next thing that happens in Matthew chapter 17? Yeah, he is the transfiguration. And so Jesus takes with him, and Matthew specifies it 6 days later, but it's the next story that he tells, and so it's soon after these events of chapters 15 and 16, which I think last week we saw were right on top of each other. And then so within a short amount of time, Jesus takes, who does he take with him? Peter, James, and John. And so a commentator I was reading today mentioned, you know, it's Peter that's going to preach the first gospel sermon. James was a significant leader in the early church, and he ended up being the first martyr. And then it was John who, lived the longest life after Jesus' ascension into heaven, and he was the one that, that penned a significant portion of the New Testament with his gospel and his letters and his prophetic book of Revelation. So. That Jesus had reserved for these three men some very significant special tasks ahead. And so there was, maybe it makes sense, aside from the fact that they seem to be his inner circle of his most trusted companions and the ones that he relates to maybe the easiest. There's some significant things that are going to happen in their lives that an event like this could help prepare them for. And so Jesus takes these three with him to a mountain by himself, and he was transfigured before them. What does that mean? He was changed. Changed into what? I mean, what was this like? What do you think they saw?
It says his face shone like the sun, so it was really bright, and
Uh-huh.
his garments became as white as light. So all of a sudden, he's just exuding this really bright light all over him.
Wow. Wow. I can't, I mean, I can picture it, but I can't picture it. Kind of like when John describes, in Revelation, John describes heaven, and we can picture the things that he's writing about, but we know that whatever we picture doesn't do it justice, isn't significant enough. And so as Matthew is writing these words about what Jesus appeared like, and remember, Matthew wasn't there, he didn't see it, so he's relying on a witness, what Peter, James, and John later will tell him about this appearance, and the Holy Spirit's guidance and all that. I understand that, but Matthew himself hasn't seen this, and so for him to write about it must have been, I wonder what he was picturing, or how he was thinking what it must have looked like, and then he's trying to convey to us what it looked like. But it's interesting that Jesus says, at the end of 16, the Son of Man is going to come in his glory, in his glorified state, and then the next story that we have is from Matthew is Jesus in his glorified state being seen by these three apostles. And so what does this do for these men? I mean, why this? Why, if Jesus is going to go do this, why does he take Peter, James, and John with him? Okay.
So he put him higher than the prophets and higher than the law.
Okay. All right. That's good. We're going to talk about that. To be witnesses. Okay. Don't they already know who Jesus is? Hasn't Peter already made the confession?
But do they really understand? Well, there's more to come.
Yeah. Okay. Peter has already said, Jesus said, who do you say that I am? Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God.
But this here takes it beyond the human aspect. I think probably up to this point, they're really thinking human, because especially Peter's rebuking Jesus when he said he was going to die. I think they still had the human ideal and everything, and this takes it beyond the.
Okay.
Jesus shows them that I am going to be something different.
Yeah.
Than what you are anticipating.
Okay. Yeah. I like that. I think Jesus does indicate to them there is something far more significant going on here than they can imagine, or that they have imagined up to this point, or that they have understood. And so when Jesus is transfigured before them, who else appears? Moses and Elijah. It's an interesting question. How do Peter, James, and John know who that is?
Well, God had to reveal it to them.
Okay.
Reveal to them, maybe like Jesus.
I was wondering if this was something that was told to them later or something. Yeah, that was Elijah and Moses.
Well, Peter, based on what Peter says in the moment, he recognizes who they are, because he wants to, yeah. And I think what is demonstrated to us here is that in that, Moses and Elijah are not in their physical earthly form either. They're in their heavenly form, and Peter, James, and John instantly recognize them. I think there's an indication there that in that form we are recognizable, that they were recognized because of the form they were in. The passage in 1 Corinthians 13 that says, now abide faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And love is the greatest because it continues into heaven. I mean, faith and hope disappear at the end of this age, but love continues. And how in heaven can I love somebody if I don't know who they are? And so I don't think we'll have to be, it's not like when you go to a new place and they have the introductions and everybody's wearing a name tag. There's not going to be that in heaven, where we will know who Moses and Elijah and Peter and everybody else is instantly. We will know everyone, because that's the way love works. You only love if you know. You only fully love if you know fully who someone is. And so, I think we have an indication here about how that works, our relationships with one another, after we leave this form behind. So Peter wants to do something special to commemorate the occasion. Wants to build tabernacles, and he's not, if you're thinking of a great big structure, that's not what he's thinking about. He's thinking of a booth, something probably similar to what they would have built during their celebration of Passover, that there was a lot of, or the Feast of Booths, that they would have built a booth in the yard to commemorate the wandering in the wilderness and the delivery from Egypt. And so Peter is wanting to make three not significant structures, but wanting to make three structures that would commemorate these three men being there together in their glorified state. And as soon as Peter offers that, what happens?
God speaks up and says, "This is my son."
God speaks up, and what happened to Moses and Elijah? They're gone. They're back wherever they came from. And so the only one then that is left is Jesus. And I've always wondered, at what point does Jesus reassume his physical form and not be in his glorified form? I've always wondered, is it in that moment when Moses and Elijah are gone that Jesus resumes his physical form, or does he stay in that glorified form for a moment at least while God is making that declaration? I don't know. I don't know if it's significant or if it matters.
Does it mean anything that, as he was speaking, God, pretty much interrupted him and said, "Hey, pay attention to my son and listen to
Yes.
what he has to say."
This is not a corrective statement that can wait to be made. This is not something that we're going to wait and pull Peter aside and correct him, privately or afterwards. This has to be corrected now, because this notion can't stand. Even in somebody whose heart Peter wasn't attempting to be evil, or he wasn't attempting to be disrespectful in any way. He was sincere. He thought he was being very respectful. But the application of what he was saying, if carried out, would have been blasphemous. Because he was trying to elevate Moses and Elijah to the same status as Jesus. Now, if you think about, in the Jewish mind, in their history of recorded scripture, who are the greatest men that ever lived? Moses and Elijah. Moses was the bringer of the law. He was the one who stood face to face with God and received the law written by God's hand on the tablets. That was Moses. Elijah, what is significant about his departure from earth? He didn't die. He was taken up by God in a flaming chariot and was deemed, worthy enough or great enough by God that he didn't even taste of death. And so he was elevated as the prophet of all prophets in their way of thinking because of his status or his stature. And so here you have the greatest two characters, the greatest two people in Jewish scripture, and Jesus. And Peter says these three are the big three. These three are he is elevating Jesus to the status of Moses and Elijah, which in his mind you don't do lightly. You don't place somebody on the pedestal that Moses and Elijah are on. And so in Peter's mind, he is elevating Jesus, but what really is he doing? He's bringing Jesus down to the level of two men. And so God can't let that stand. And where have we seen God speak out in this way before? At Jesus' baptism, the voice of God is heard, and what else happens in that moment?
The heavens open
The heavens open up and the dove descends, and that dove is the Holy Spirit. So in this case, we have the voice of God descending from heaven. We have Jesus there, but we don't have the dove. But what do we have? We have a bright light that comes from a cloud that overshadows them, and the voice that comes out of that cloud. Then, so most likely, that is the Spirit. I mean, that is His presence in this. That is Him overshadowing the others and illuminating Jesus as the one who is God's Son, as the one who is most significant in this exchange. And so, it wasn't appropriate in that moment for the dove to come and descend upon Jesus and not land on the other two. We needed to completely obscure the other two and allow Jesus, and only Jesus, to be seen in this moment. And so it's a significant event here that takes place, and one that elevates Jesus and confirms that Jesus is higher than the giver of the law. He's higher than the prophets. He is God's Son. He is God's messenger in a special way that has never been revealed through any of the other great servants of God in the past.
Well, and they represent the three covenants that, right? Well, two covenants, but.
Yeah.
The prophets, everything led up to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that was given to Moses and everything that Elijah and the prophets prophesied about.
Right.
Was about Jesus.
Right.
And so it's all fulfilled.
And it's significant. I mean, it's significant enough to mention later. The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 1 talks about that progression a little bit. If I can turn there. Hebrews chapter 1, beginning verse 1, God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions of many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the world, and He is the radiance of His glory and the exact representation of His nature, and upholds all things by the word of His power. And so, in that moment where Peter sees Moses and Elijah and Jesus, and they're all radiating that light, they're all in their glorified state, and then he makes that comparison that they all must be equal, then it's made obvious that it's Jesus' radiance that is above all others. It's His glory that supersedes that of Moses and Elijah. A significant event that takes place here at the beginning of Matthew chapter 17. What does Jesus tell them to do as they're coming down from the mountain? Don't tell anyone. Are you kidding me? What have we just seen? And you want me to tell nobody? Sometimes Jesus asks us to do hard things. Sometimes He asks us to do things that are very hard. Sometimes He asks us not to do things, and it's equally hard not to do them. Can you imagine, Peter, James, and John getting back and reconnecting with the other disciples and them saying, well, what was that all about? Oh, nothing. I'll tell you later.
It's kind of interesting, though, because later on, when you look at what happens next coming up, you kind of see maybe why you only had those three.
Yeah.
Welcome to be with you.
Yeah, and there's stuff going on with the others while they're up on the mountain, and so that is a significant event as well. There's a statement there about Elijah, and his disciples asked then, in verse 10, why did the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he answered, Elijah is coming and will restore all things, but I say to you that Elijah already came, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. And so I think there was a little bit of a misunderstanding maybe on Peter, James, and John's part when they saw Elijah standing there and they knew who he was. Maybe this is what they meant by Elijah is returning, and Elijah is going to declare now to the world who Jesus is. And so there was a bit of a correction that needed to take place there so that they understood that the Elijah that was returning or that was coming back that was talked about in Scripture was not an actual physical return of the prophet Elijah, but it was someone who was like Elijah who is John the Baptist. Um, so,
I don't understand this. I don't understand how this is worded. I mean, maybe it's just this version, but when he says Elijah is coming, and will restore all things. I don't understand that
uh-huh.
because he's talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist has already came.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand. I don't understand that statement.
Okay. So they're putting that, their question asks, why didn't the scribes say that Elijah must come first? So they're still putting that in a future sense. If Elijah was here and then we made the misunderstanding of trying to recognize that he was here and then you sent him away, how is it going to happen that he's supposed to come first? And Jesus said, well, the scripture's right. Elijah is coming first. In fact, he already came. He's already been here. And he's already, yeah.
Trying to understand that. I mean,
Yeah,
it didn't make sense to me.
yeah. I think maybe it's not the way we would have expected it to be worded or something like that, but I think that's what he's saying is the scriptures that say Elijah is coming are correct. In fact, they've already been fulfilled. Well, at the next section here, some of the disciples experienced a problem. What goes amiss? There was a man who falls on his knees before Jesus, and what's wrong with his son?
He's a lunatic.
He is a lunatic.
Very ill.
He is, I think some of the older translations maybe say epileptic. The commentary I read today said that's not a good word. But epileptic is not a good word. It's not a physiological, a medical condition, maybe as much as it is a mental condition.
A lunatic is someone who's been touched by the moon.
Touched by the moon.
Luna,
Yeah.
they
They have a tick
someone
that's from the moon.
who's
Yeah.
crazy because of
Yeah.
the moon. So that's not a medical term.
Yeah. So I think it's probably more of a mental health thing than a physical health thing, as we would associate epilepsy with physical health. And so, but he's very ill. He falls into the fire. He falls into the water. It's a whether it's suicide attempts or whether it's just not being able to value life or understand pain or whatever, that he's doing these things from a mental health standpoint. But he brought them to the disciples. It brought his son to the disciples, and what happened? Well, they couldn't cast out the illness. They couldn't heal him. And remember, Jesus, James, and John, and Peter are up on the mountain while this is taking place. And so it's the 9 that remain, or some of the 9 that remain, or one of the, whoever are gathered there. And how do you explain this? Why are they not able to cast out this illness?
Jesus hadn't given them the power.
Well, Jesus had given them the power because they were amazed at the limited commission earlier on. They were amazed when they came back, and even the demons listened to us. We're able to heal people. So they had healed people. Verse 20, Jesus nails it down, because of the littleness of your faith. For truly I say to you, if you have the faith as a mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it shall move, and nothing shall be impossible to you. As we think back about some things that have taken place, and we've looked back, last week we talked about, the increasing attacks against Jesus and his disciples by the Pharisees. As we look at some of the charges that are being leveled against them. And we look at even how the disciples themselves at times are interacting with Jesus and, Jesus, how are you going to take care of this problem of so many mouths to feed? Haven't you been paying attention? I got this. Who's that on the water? It's a ghost walking towards us. There's some things that have happened that have indicated that the disciples are not maybe coming along as fast as Jesus would like them to come along in their faith. And so I think it's not hard to understand that there may be occasions when they question their ability, or they question their own understanding of who Jesus is, or Jesus has given us the authority to cast out these illnesses or the sickness, so I have the power to do it, and so I'm going to say, I rebuke you, and when I say it, nothing happens, because it's not by my authority that it happens. And I don't know that this is what happened, but some scenarios that could play out where the method or the effort by which they're trying to remove the illness is not, the emphasis is not where it should be. And so Jesus places the emphasis where it should be. It should be on faith. It should be on their understanding, their belief in who he is, their belief in who God is. And if they were using any other method to try to affect this healing, then it wasn't going to work, because they were doing it wrong.
I think, when they did the limited commission, the excitement was high.
Uh-huh.
The enthusiasm was high. Hey, boy, look
Yeah.
at this. Because they went home and they went back and they reported. Even the demons,
Yeah.
listened to us and like that. But you wonder. What I wondered at this point is that kind of waning.
Yeah.
Enthusiasm that they had at the limited commission.
That's a good question. It's very possible that maybe their excitement for the work that Jesus has given them to do is waning. I mean, we experience that, I think.
Is it a possibility that they were relying on themselves?
I think that,
Not putting God into the
yeah.
mix of what they were trying to do?
I think that would be an indication of the lack of faith, that they were trying to do it by some other means, or they were trying to rely on their own. I'm a follower of Jesus. That makes me pretty special. I can do it on my own or by myself. I think there's that possibility. I think there's the possibility that I think there's lots of things going on here. I think there's a possibility that Jesus has just taken James and John and Peter on a little side trip, and maybe we're kind of bummed we didn't get to go with Jesus on this side trip, or there's a little jealousy. We know there was jealousy among their ranks at other times when they had arguments about who was to be first. So maybe there was some of that going on. Maybe there was, Jesus leaves town with Peter, James, and John, and the Pharisees don't know where Jesus is, but they know these men follow Jesus, so we're going to hound them. And maybe there was some Pharisees standing in the background saying, bet you can't do it. And maybe they listened to that and thought, well, maybe we can't. So there's lots of things going on, I think, that are possible reasons why their faith was wavering, but it ultimately boils down to it was a faith problem. And so Jesus steps in and says, is able to cure him because Jesus never has a faith problem. It's an opportunity to illustrate that if their faith is where it's supposed to be in Jesus, then that power is available to their disposal for them to dispense. I think it's good that they saw him successfully do what they were not able to do, because it establishes Jesus' authority, and it also gives them a lesson about what the proper method is that they were missing out on in some way. So an interesting exchange there. What does Jesus tell them right next in verse 22 there? Yeah, the Son of Man is going to be delivered over, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And they were thrilled with that news. They were grieved by that news. I mean, Jesus is getting more and more blunt with them about both who he is and about what's going to happen. He is not going to have them be unprepared for the events that take place. Even though when the events finally do happen, they are pretty well unprepared. I mean, they're not really ready for how it goes. The next story there, when they had come to Capernaum, what is Peter asked?
Does your teacher
Doesn't Jesus believe in paying taxes? Why would they ask such a question?
Always to put it to the test.
Always put him to the test. If he doesn't pay the taxes, what are they going to do? Report him to the Romans for not paying taxes. If he does pay the taxes, what are they going to do? He collaborates with the Romans. He pays taxes. So this is one of those occasions where they think, oh, we're going to corner him and get him in this way. And so how does Peter answer, or how does Jesus answer it? With a question. As he always does, he puts the question back to them. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? And the answer is from strangers. And so Jesus says, consequently, the sons are exempt. So who is Jesus? Is he a son or a stranger? Well, he's the son. He is the son.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And so if there's anybody who has the right to say, nope, I'm going to skip the taxes, it's the son. Jesus has demonstrated his sonship. They have confessed him as the son. Okay? And so they understand, I think, the point that he is making. But then in verse 27, but lest we give them an offense, go to the sea, throw in a hook, first fish that you catch, open up his mouth, and in it you'll find a coin that is worth enough to pay the taxes for you and me both. I know, right? Chuck, have you ever caught one of those fish? No.
The only thing that they have in their mouth is my hook.
Yeah, I know, and some of them don't give it back either. What a neat miracle. If there are minor miracles, this is a minor one, but still just kind of cool to think about. How does Jesus know the one that swallowed the coin is going to be the first one to catch the? Because he's Jesus, because he is the Son, right? And so, it's just a neat story. So then, verse 18, at that time the disciples come to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And can you see them all standing up a little bit straighter? Jesus, we got a question. And kind of trying to get in front of everybody else, and be the one to be in the line of his eyes, maybe. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus, as he always does, answers in an unexpected way. What does he do?
He brings a child to himself, sets him before him, and says, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. Unless you become like children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. What is it about children that Jesus seems to like? Their innocence, their humility. The next verse, whoever then humbles himself as a child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Trusting, accepting. Verse 5, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. I think Jesus just does things over and over and over again to reverse their thinking, to take the things that they're thinking about and try to wipe that slate clean and take their thinking in a whole new direction. And so as they're thinking, the answer to this question has to be, who has followed him the most faithfully, who has been the loudest in supporting him, who has followed him the most days or been with him the longest. All of these things, they're trying to build up in their minds their own characteristics that set them apart from everyone else or that make them better than everyone else. And Jesus takes that type of thinking and says, that is foreign to the idea of who even is in the kingdom of heaven. You can't employ that kind of thinking, and not just to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, but even to get into the kingdom of heaven. You can't use that kind of thinking. And so Jesus just completely turns it around on him and says, you're thinking about elevating, you're thinking about lifting yourself and praising yourself and these things, but what we need to do is the exact opposite and think about humbling ourselves. Chuck?
Looking back at the last part of the last chapter, who's the greatest, they ask who's the greatest in chapter 18, kingdom. But then look back on the other, you know, of all the people who deserved to show that he was the greatest. I'm not, you know, I am a son, so I should not have to pay this tax, but he shows his humbleness, his willingness to follow the rules, so even the earthly rules,
Uh-huh.
you know. So he shows he shows how to be greatest is by being less.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. If there's, Jesus could have ended all debate when they say, Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He says, me.
Exactly.
There's no argument to that. Nobody can say that he's not right. But instead, what does he do? I think he makes, after his answer, the answer is obvious, it's him, but it's because he's the one that does the very thing he's talking about. Who is it that has humbled himself more than Jesus? Philippians chapter 2, he humbled himself to take on the form of a servant. He did not consider heaven a thing to be held on to or grasped, and he humbled himself to take on the form of a man. So Jesus has humbled himself and shown us that he has humbled himself more than any other person. So he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now we've just got to be like him. And instead of trying to elevate ourselves to be like him, we need to follow his example of humility.
Then even later, they're told, whoever desires to be first shall be last.
Right? Yeah. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. Yeah.
I feel like this was kind of like a kick below the belt to them, but I know that I consider the disciples to be fairly young people. I don't think they were any older than Jesus, and Jesus was 30, and
Yeah.
a lot of people think Peter was just 20 and he was the oldest because he was the only other one that had to pay the tax besides Jesus. So I think like telling like 17-year-olds, or I don't know if you wanted to be 25, let them be 25, saying, okay, you got to become a kid again. And they're like, wait, we just got done with that.
Yeah.
You know, we don't want to be that anymore. And he's like,
Yeah.
you know, you have to humble yourselves. And I think that's like really like hits hard for
Yeah.
them.
Well, it's interesting. I think humility tends to be a sign of extreme youth, or I don't want to say extreme age, but maturity, right? I mean, I think children tend to be pretty humble about who they are and about what their abilities are, and willing to ask for help and those kind of things that we kind of use as humble. But it is that kind of, you know, in our middle years where we think we can conquer the world, or we think we can do everything on our own, or we have enough strength to do everything that we need to do, or whatever, that tends to be associated with pride. And then as we age a little bit and we realize I would have done a lot better had I not tried doing it on my own, that's where the humility kind of brings itself back in. And so I think they are in some ways as you know, immature because they're not very old men, and immature because they're new to the faith, and all of these ways in which they're immature. They're getting some crash courses in maturity from Jesus as he is demonstrating for them how they need to live. I think one of the most significant things that Jesus does in all of his ministry is the night of his betrayal. He begins that time in the upper room by teaching them about service, by washing their feet. You know, if you think about it, Jesus knows this is the last time he has them all together before his crucifixion. And he has one final shot to teach them a lesson. And he could have taught that lesson on anything. But what he taught them was humility, service. Because even at that point in their ministry, or after that long of following him in his ministry, there was still problems among them about who was the greatest and who was going to stoop and wash the other's feet. Well, if they'd been paying attention for the last 3 years, every one of them should have at the very least, washed Jesus' feet. But every one of them really should have known that they should have washed each other's as well. But even after following him for 3 years, they still don't get the humility lesson. So Jesus teaches that a lot along the way before they finally get it. I think it's one that some of us have to hear lots of times before we finally get it as well. That humility really does matter. Woe to the world because of what? Stumbling blocks. But we don't have to worry about stumbling blocks because we can escape them.
Well, it says it's inevitable that stumbling blocks will come.
It is inevitable that stumbling blocks will come.
Well, that man removed
Yeah. And woe to that one through whom the stumbling block does come. There are people out there that will try to derail our faith. And that's bad. It's the opposite of, in Romans chapter 10, how precious are the feet of those who bring glad tidings of good things. If you're bringing the gospel of salvation to people, there's no more noble thing that you can do. There's no more righteous thing that you can do to try to bring that gospel. But if you're doing just the opposite and taking people who have faith and have belief in God and you're trying to derail that, then that's a bad deal. We don't ever want to be in that position. To the point that Jesus has an extreme statement in the next verse. If our hand or our foot causes us to stumble, cut it off. Is he serious? Hyperbole? I think he's speaking with hyperbole. When Jesus tells us to hate our mother and father, is he serious to hate our mother and father? No, he would never teach us that, because we're supposed to love our mother and father. That's part of the law. That's part of who we are as God's people.
He said, whoever loves mother or father more
Yeah.
than me.
By comparison, our love for God should be so great that by comparison, our love for our parents looks like hatred. So when Jesus says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Or if your right foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. Or if your eye, if it's better to having, if your eye causes you to stumble in the next verse, pluck it out and throw it from you. So what is, in his hyperbole, what point is he trying to make? Yeah, if something is a source of temptation for you, get rid of it. Stay away from it. Don't associate with it. Whether it's a person, a place, a thing, an object, whatever it is, nothing is worth your soul. Nothing is worth your soul. And so, he asked the question back at the end of chapter 16, verse 26, for what will a man be profited if he gains the whole world but forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? The answer it's a rhetorical question. The answer is nothing. There's nothing that's more important than our soul. And so whatever it is that we're clinging to that becomes a stumbling block to us, it's not more important than our soul. Get rid of it. And it should be, it should be so obvious that we give those things up that even to the point of chopping off a body part should not be out of the question if that's what it takes to retain our soul. That's what he's saying.
I think it's important to, there are people who want to go to one extreme and another extreme. So, for instance, if someone's addicted to porn, they'd be like, giving up my computer and, never looking at the internet is too extreme.
Yeah.
For someone else, it's I have to stop. I have to find someone else to do that for me. I have to
Yep.
find someone to put restrictions on stuff for me, and it's not too extreme.
Yeah.
And so I think that shows more faithfulness
Yeah.
than just kind of how far you're willing to go to make sure that
Yeah.
you don't commit it again.
I think you're right. And thinking about there's nothing too extreme for us to give up or for us to lay aside in our service of Christ, our attempt, our pursuit of righteousness. You know what's extreme? Hell. Hell is extreme. And if anything else by comparison is mild. And so, when Jesus says take up our cross daily, it's not a mild thing. It's not a minor inconvenience. It's life altering. It's life changing. And so to take up our cross and make such a drastic change that it affects everything that we do and everything about who we are, that's what taking up our cross is. Jesus next tells a story about the about the shepherd. If he has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, he just writes it off as a loss and the insurance pays for it.
You've been listening to Gary too long.
I know, Gary. I'm channeling Gary tonight. I've thought of that because he does that kind of stuff a lot, doesn't he? Yeah. So if 99 are safe and one is lost, what do? We go find the one. The one that's lost is what matters. The one that's lost is, that's where our focus is.
That sheep is worth, the value is worth the time and effort.
Right. That sheep is,
It's got value.
it has value. It has intrinsic value. And so it's worth the time and effort that it will take to do that searching and find it. And then he says, if it turns out that he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. Think about that for a moment. If you have the 100 together, do you call your friends and neighbors in the morning and say, whew, I counted them this morning, they're all still there. Hooray. You don't do that. And if you wake up and there's one gone the next morning, though, you go and you might call the neighbors then and say, help me find it. And if you find it, then there's that celebration of we have found it and it can be returned to the fold.
That's why the father threw the party for the prodigal son.
Uh-huh.
Even the son that had been with him the whole time was like mad at him.
Yeah.
He's like, son, you've been here all the time. You
Yeah.
never left me.
Yeah.
But your brother here who left and has come back, we celebrate him.
Yeah. That's right. And so, so Jesus still, and remember, all this starts out with the idea of who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus keeps coming back to this idea of children, and thus it is not the will of the Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones perish. And so, we've had the talk about the stumbling block, and if somebody does cast a stumbling block in front of one of the children and they are removed from the fold, they fall away, that's not insignificant to God. That is a significant occurrence. God is going to do what he can to restore that one and to go out and try to find that one that has been lost, because it is not his will that the stumbling block was there in the first place and for that one to be lost. Jesus next here gives us some very practical advice on how to be restored to one who has sinned. If your brother sins and you reprove him in private, if he listens to you, you've won your brother. If he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer.
Connect that to that lost sheep
Okay?
story, because, you're doing everything you can.
Right.
That brother or sister back to Christ. And it's not just you. If you try it, then you grab somebody else and take them with you.
Mhm.
And that's the thing. We've got to be relentless in trying to bring a brother or sister back to Christ.
Yeah.
And we always got to be willing to accept, their repentance and
Yeah.
forgive them when they come back. And I think a lot of times we tend to not do that. We're guilty sometimes of holding a grudge against somebody when they come back.
I think that's possible, especially I think sometimes if it's somebody that, well, I wonder how long this is going to last kind of thing. We kind of get that attitude sometimes, and that's not the way it's supposed to be at all. But we should follow this this method that Jesus lays out for how to deal with somebody who offends us through sin or however you want to say it. And how often does this actually happen, where we follow this progression of things, where we go and talk to somebody privately, and then if that doesn't work to resolve the issue, then we meet with another person or two who can serve as an arbitrator, who can serve as a witness to help us make sure. And it's not just so that I can have somebody to back up what I'm saying, and so that Don doesn't have the chance to weasel out of apologizing again. But it's it's a neutral, it's an independent person who can say, I've heard both sides of the story, and Jason, maybe you're the one that's holding a grudge here. Maybe this needs to be resolved, in a different way than you're demanding of Dawn. And so there's some give and take, and there's some back and forth that goes on there. I think that that we need to be humble enough, have enough humility to say, I'm not perfect. But after that step of taking a witness or two with us, and the issue is still not resolved, then we bring it before the church. And the church, not in anger, not in wrath, not in, this self-righteous judgment, condemns somebody who has been taken up in a sin, but the church then takes the disciplinary measures that are necessary or that are prescribed in Scripture so that we can try to restore that brother to their rightful place, which is at one with God's kingdom. And
Then it goes along with, too, what we were just saying about whatever the sin is, put it away, and if it's as far as cutting off the hand, it affects our relationships.
right, yeah,
When there is someone who's trying to destroy us spiritually, we've got to rethink that relationship.
Yeah.
And it's hard,
yes,
because we want that relationship.
yeah,
But if it's not, if it's not based on God's standards, then it's just
yeah, and I think there's so much at work in this chapter between the idea of humility and being humble enough to kind of accept our position or who we need to be in the Lord. And there's also, which is difficult. I mean, the call to humility it goes against our nature. And so we have to suppress kind of looking out for ourselves or looking out for number one, and we have to start looking out for other people. That's a difficult thing. But then, the idea of completely removing from our lives those things that would serve as a stumbling block to us. I mean, that's tough. That's hard. That's not an easy thing to do. And now this teaching on how to be restored to somebody that we're at odds with, this is not always the easiest thing to do. Especially if the relationship has already been strained through some act of sin or something like that. That relationship is already in trouble because of the sin that's there. And so to go and have this confrontation, if you will, is not always very easy.
One thing that's not mentioned in this section, he talks about the process, but he doesn't talk about the time frame.
Okay.
And that's something that it takes somebody who's got a little bit of wisdom to realize when you go to somebody who's got a sin or sinned against you, it doesn't change immediately.
Yeah.
So you can't expect, you gotta give it time.
Yeah.
And how long? That's when it's debatable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where some of that wisdom comes into play, where we can't always, in some cases, I think the sins can be great enough or have a dire enough impact upon people's lives that we need to get it taken care of quickly. Other times it can be more of a, this really is just between me and you, and all sin affects other people around us, but if there's something that's more self-contained or really is a thing between two people, sometimes we can extend that as we try to work through that with people, and the time frame may not be as critical as long as we're moving towards resolution. So, but I appreciate that. There does need to, the wisdom has to be a key ingredient in how we deal with this here. The whole next section there is on forgiveness, and we obviously don't have time to talk about that because Chuck's already rung the bell twice, but I'll forgive him. But it's a great story, one that's not unfamiliar. I mean, we're probably all fairly familiar with the story about the king who forgave a servant a large amount, and then he turned around and refused to forgive a small amount. And it's all in response to Peter's question, how many times shall I forgive? Shall I forgive 7 times? And Peter thinks he's doing great. 7 times? Wow, I'm a really good guy, Jesus, don't you think? And Jesus says, Peter, you're missing the boat, buddy. And so, yeah, he did that once. He missed the boat. But so it's a great story. You should read it. You should think about it and be forgiving.